In this video, I want to talk about ancient Sumer, just going over a little bit of information on it. So let's start. So ancient Sumer is a civilization, a Mesopotamian civilization that really is quite interesting because for a while it was basically completely lost to our modern understanding. We didn't really know it existed, and it wasn't until we started going through really the records of ancient Akkad and the Akkadian empires and Babylon and groups like that where we actually realized that, hey, they've got a civilization that they consider to be their ancient classical civilization to them, and so it's sort of doubly ancient to us. And so it's quite an interesting civilization, and it's really, by all accounts, it's between ancient Sumer and ancient Egypt, but it appears that it might just be sort of the most ancient civilization we know about. So it's quite remarkable in that way. So really quickly, let me get a probably want orange for this. When we talk about Sumer, we're talking about right here. So Mesopotamia is classically defined, as the name implies, as the land between the two rivers. That includes the land that historically the rivers might have been around, as well as sometimes we'll include this area just like really close to the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, as well as the deltas and stuff like that. So it's in Mesopotamia, and it's sort of the classical civilization that the Babylonians looked at. So the Babylonians would have looked at Sumer and said, yeah, that's our classical civilization where we get a lot of our culture from. So in this area, we've got a bunch of cities, right? So we've got some names of cities here. Some of these are modern names that we've sort of appended to the area. But so Ur, for example, if you might know that from the Bible, that's an ancient city name. So these are sort of the locations of a lot of these cities. So it's thought that the first permanently settled areas in the regions were between 5500 and 4000 BC. No one's really sure. There's a lot of speculation, but by permanently settled, we mean people were doing agriculture here and they were living in one spot and they weren't hunter-gatherers. We do know that the people who lived in this area spoke a non-Semitic language because the language was recorded and described later by Akkadian peoples, and it's very clearly not a Semitic language. There are theories that these people came from North Africa or from West Asia. This should say North African or West Asian origin. But we don't really know, and their language doesn't really help us a lot. It's known linguistically as a linguistic isolate, which means it's not known to be related in a historical comparative linguistic sort of way to any of the languages around it or to any language known. There are all sorts of crazy theories. People say, oh, it could be related to Hungarian, it could be related to Navajo. We really don't know, to be honest, and all of the theories are very tenuous. They rely on very speculative evidence, and there aren't systematic sound correspondences that are clear enough to make any identification. And so just to give you an idea of what this means, so in Spanish we might have the word dos, right? And then in French we have de, and so we can look at that and systematically say that D in Spanish is often D in French, and then other sounds might maybe in certain circumstances are systematically other sounds in French between Spanish and French, and we can posit that these two both came from Latin, which we historically know actually from historical records to be true, based off of that. And so we can actually reconstruct linguistic relationships in that way, even when, so in this case, we actually know that that is true from historical records, but if we didn't know from historical records, we could probably reconstruct that relationship. We can't do that for Sumerian, even though we know a lot about how it was pronounced because of the Akkadian sources that described its pronunciation, but we really we can't tell where it came from. It's kind of an interesting thing. And there are other linguistic isolates. For example, Basque is a linguistic isolate. There are linguistic isolates all over the world, but this is one that has that people are very interested in because it's essentially the first civilization. So the first kingdoms that are in the Sumerian records before the flood, there was a mythical flood in Sumerian history, are Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larsa, Sipar, and Shuruppak. After these first kingdoms, is eventually there were other ones that cropped up, and they might have been there around the same time. For example, Ur might have been around at the same time as Eridu. But these are in Sumerian sources considered to be the first of the kingdoms. Some cities might have had up to 80,000 people in a city. Some archaeologists estimate less, but there could have been quite a lot of people in any given city. And given that the world population at the time was probably around 27 million, that is a considerable. That is quite a large city. Some people, before we talked about how they might have been of West Asian or North African origin, some people even have speculated that these people might have just been indigenous to the area for a very long time beforehand. So maybe they didn't migrate to the area. They just sort of culturally evolved into a more permanent means of or type of living. We don't really know. And just because we have pretty much continuous, beforehand a continuous population in the area doesn't mean that we know that. But we do have, before the Sumerians appear to have been permanently situated in ancient Sumer, some idea that there might have been other individuals in the area. So culture, we know from things they left behind that they had pottery, so they were fairly advanced in that field. They wore feathered headdresses, at least in some occasions. They had technology like knives, drills, and wedges. So these weren't necessarily Stone Age individuals. They used writing tablets, and they did eventually develop a system of writing, which we'll talk about. They tracked time with lunar months, and it appears that they had a lot of music. We found musical instruments. And there's some indication that perhaps in the early stages of their history, they practiced polyandry, so the practice of one woman being married to multiple men. Some sources indicate that this was illegalized at a certain point, which implies that it was legal at a certain point. And it's possible that their sort of sexual mores were quite different from later cultures like the Akkadians and others in Mesopotamia. For example, it's not really known. It's speculated based off a lot of sources that premarital sexual relationships might not have been as taboo as maybe in later civilizations. That there wasn't this idea of virginity among being important in marriage. In other words, there weren't these later tests of virginity that you'd see in later cultures. As we said before, the language is a linguistic isolate. It was written in cuneiform, which is wedge shapes. So they used a wedge stylus in clay to make these sorts of markings that we have here. Is possibly the earliest writing in the world. We have ancient Egyptian writing that is quite early. We don't have the sort of evolutionary steps that led to ancient Egyptian writing, which is interesting because it sort of implies that maybe that there is a longer history to the writing of ancient Egyptian than we know of from archaeological records. But we do have the sort of evolutionary steps in the writing of cuneiform. Originally, essentially little icons representing certain types of property, like a cow or something, would be pressed into clay, and they would use those to count or to keep inventory of property. And then later on, over long periods of time, it evolved into a full-fledged system of writing, which could handle anything essentially that was spoken, a fully linguistic system. But because we don't necessarily know all the pieces in the puzzle to the ancient Egyptian writing system. We don't know that this is the earliest writing system in the world, but it very well could be. And depending on when in the stages of its evolution you consider it to be a full-fledged writing system, it was certainly very old. So they also developed and wrote down epic poetry, essentially. So the Epic of Gilgamesh, which we think of often as an Akkadian thing, it's the sort of story behind it was originally a Sumerian story. Religiously, there's a lot of interesting things here. Creation is the result of Hieroi Gamoi, which is holy marriages. This is actually a Greek term, not a Sumerian term, but it's used because it applies to a lot of ancient civilizations. For example, in ancient Egypt, we have this sort of concept around too, and we sort of see it in ancient Greek and all around, really. But they also believed in a great flood, and if you read the Epic of Gilgamesh, we actually have a Noah-like character that saves humanity in a large boat. And in the Epic of Gilgamesh, is actually blessed with eternal life. We have anthropomorphic deities, so An, heaven, Ki, earth, Enlil, storm, wind, or rain, Ninlil, south wind, Inanna, love, beauty, sexuality, war, Utu, sun, and Sin, moon. There are more than that, but you see we have a lot of these sort of primitive categories that you see in a lot of ancient civilizations. We have this idea of the heaven and the earth, and this feeds into our idea of the sacred marriages, where heaven and earth are I believe one of the sacred marriages. We also have love, beauty, sexuality, and war, this union of sexuality and war. And actually, in ancient Roman mythology, Venus is thought to have, in a very early stage, actually been much like that. So a lot in common with other religions, especially this Great Flood, which is found in religions all over the world, including Christianity, Judaism, and I believe Islam. We've got beautiful art, and we know that a lot of the components of this were actually imported from very far away. So we know that there was a complex system of trade. You can take a look at sort of what they're wearing. We know that there were probably quite a lot, quite an established sort of culture behind dress. You see people dressed in different sorts of ways. And really, I want to end with this. We don't know everything about Sumer. We have these sort of very interesting relics that are left behind, but we really, at the end of the day, are learning more right now, and we probably never know everything about Sumer. It's really quite an enigma. There are a lot of records, and the Sumerian language is now fairly well understood, but it is quite an enigma. So I've got 2 references here if you'd like to check more out. And that's all for this presentation.